Hey there, and greetings! Welcome to this Joy of Translating podcast covering the second half of Mark chapter 2. This is the podcast where I invite you to collaborate with me to create a new Bible translation that faithfully communicates the meaning of the biblical text in clear and natural English. There's nothing that helps you dig deeper into God's Word than trying to translate it so that it doesn't sound like a translation. Let's make a translation that promotes the enjoyment of God's Word and one that can be understood by children and podcast listeners. In reaching toward this goal, we'll definitely be standing on the shoulders of others who have created good Bible translations. There are 3 words that encapsulate our goal in creating a good, meaning-based Bible translation, and I have already used them above. They are clear, natural, and accurate or faithful. Hopefully, the first word, clear, is clear. It means that people understand it without extra effort, and they don't misunderstand it. By natural, I mean that the language doesn't sound stilted to native English speakers. Our translation shouldn't give itself away as a translation by using strange words or putting the words together in a strange order. And finally, we want an accurate and faithful translation. This means that the message received is what the author or speaker intended. The translation doesn't add or take away from what was originally intended. If the original instruction said to build a doghouse, the reader or listener doesn't build a garage or condominium instead. These are not usually quite the same goals of someone producing a literal translation. A literal translator works in a word-by-word fashion, choosing each word according to what he considers the best sense in the biblical context. But inevitably, even when trying to rearrange the words in the best order, a word-for-word translation will always put words together in ways that seem unnatural or strange-sounding. This also results in the translation being unclear. The translator will say that his translation is accurate, but by this he means that each word was a really good choice to translate each word of the text. And nowadays, I'm sure that the translators for literal versions know that their publishers are planning to produce an edition with study notes that will explain what his word-for-word accurate translation is supposed to mean. It actually turns out to be rather helpful if a literal translation is unnatural sounding and a bit unclear, because those two things might alert the reader to look for some footnote that might help him understand what is being said. But unfortunately, there are hard verses in literal Bible translations which don't give such a clue. Because of an unperceived degree of ambiguity or unnaturalness, readers can come away with a very wrong impression of what the writer was meaning. The problem is made worse because our modern culture is so far removed from ancient biblical culture. So again, it's important for every believer to have a literal Bible translation that shows the form of the original text, and also to have a meaning-based translation that gives the meaning in a clear, natural, and accurate manner. So let's read Mark chapter 2 in my new translation starting at verse 18. You can follow along in the episode notes. On another day, John the Baptist's disciples were following the Jewish tradition of abstaining from eating. The sect of the Pharisees were also doing this. So some people came to Jesus and said, "John's disciples often abstain from eating. The Pharisees also do the same. Why don't your disciples?" Jesus answered by giving this comparison. The guests at a wedding feast would not be expected to abstain from eating, would they? While the groom is still part of the celebration, that would be highly unlikely. But if enemies came in and killed the groom, then everyone in the wedding party would abstain from eating. Someday I will suddenly be taken away, and that's the time when my disciples will mourn for me and abstain from eating. Then Jesus gave them two more comparisons. No one is going to patch a big hole in an old shirt using a brand new piece of cloth. The next time the shirt was washed, the patch of new cloth would shrink and pull away from the old cloth, making an even bigger hole. Let's also use new wine as an example. New wine can't be put into an old wineskin, because the gas given off by the new wine would not be able to escape from the old wineskin. The skin would burst open and spill all of the wine. New wine has to be put into new wineskins. One Sabbath day, Jesus and his disciples were walking through a large wheat field. Because they were hungry, his disciples picked some of the stalks of wheat and ate the grains. Some Pharisees were with them and said to Jesus, "Look what your disciples are doing. They're forbidden to do that on the Sabbath." Jesus answered them, "You ought to recall the story about David, when he and the men who were with him were in need and were hungry. David went to the Lord's tent and asked the high priest Abiathar for bread. David was given the sacred presentation bread that is always put in the holy place in the Lord's tent. Only the priests are permitted to eat that bread, but David and his men ate it, and in their situation no one considers what they did to be a sin." Then Jesus added, "God gave the command about the Sabbath day in order to benefit people, not to make people slaves of the Sabbath day. For that reason, and since I am the Son of Man, my authority as Lord extends to what may or may not be done on the Sabbath." We can find some good examples in Chapter 2 of the cultural difficulties I mentioned above for modern readers. A meaning-based translation can tell the reader a little more about why old wineskins would crack if you put new wine in them. The original readers understood about that without needing a footnote, and I want my readers and podcast listeners to understand without having to resort to a footnote. In the case of the story of the disciples walking through a wheat field, I give a footnote to explain that the picking of grain by hand was not really forbidden by the Mosaic law, but it might be a debatable prohibition from Jewish tradition at best. Then when Jesus gave the example of David getting bread from the tabernacle, I'm afraid that many modern readers would miss the whole point of why Jesus gave that example. Mark's readers and Jesus' audience would have understood his point without making it explicit. In a meaning-based translation, it is permissible for implicit information that would have been understood by the original audience to be made explicit for modern readers. This can be done in the text or in a footnote. In this case, I boldly chose to put it right in the text. There is other information about the title, the Son of Man, and Jesus' use of the word Lord that I gave in a footnote. This is a case where Jesus' meaning would have been ambiguous for his original audience. So I invite you to look at the footnote for verse 28 that's found in the episode notes. There's so much more that we could say about the two passages I've read today. May the Lord bless you real good as you meditate on God's Word.